Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. In this video, I'm going to be talking in general terms about the Vikings, which I suppose is a bit obvious given all that over there. Yes, indeed, the Vikings. Oh, the Vikings. They who sailed around in fancy-looking ships with dragon heads on them while committing all sorts of unspeakably nefarious deeds, taking cruelty, wanton lust, brutality, and every other evil thing you can think of to Olympian heights of lowness. Oh, yes. Or at least that's the popular image of them. But there is a problem with that. A problem so often found when history is concerned. It's totally wrong. But I hear you say, we know all about the Vikings. They were merciless murderers and rapists. Everyone knows that. Well, you see, at one time everyone also knew that the earth was flat and that it lay of the center of the universe. But it isn't, and it didn't. So much for knowing things. In their own day, the Vikings got what we'd call today a bad press. Historians of the time, usually Christian monks, since they were the only people generally able to read and write, and coincidentally the most frequent victims themselves of the Viking raids, gleefully writing down lurid accounts of Viking brutality. Since, you see, they were pagans, since they were pagans, they were obviously servants of Satan. That went without saying. While, of course, glossing over exactly the same things being done by Christians, sort of beginning a slanted view of the Vikings that has lingered right down to our own times. It would have been a bit like asking a sheep to write an unbiased account of foxes and wolves. You're not going to get a really accurate picture. Say Vikings, and what instantly springs to mind? Non-stop savage brutality, 24/7, 365 days a year, raiding, looting, killing, raping any woman who still had a pulse. Yeah, probably a few didn't, actually. And burning things, especially raping and burning. They were very good at burning. Yes, they raided. Yes, they burned things, as I said. They were very good at that. And they raped women. But see, that's only a part of the picture, and an exaggerated part as well. There's a lot more to the Vikings than that. And without them, Europe would be a very different place today, because their influence was considerable across a wide range of things. Here in Ireland, for example, most of the major towns, including the capital, Dublin, or Dublin as they called it, they weren't founded by the native Irish. No, they were founded by the Vikings, or more correctly, the Old Norse, we should call them. When they were founding things like that, they weren't strictly speaking Vikings, but that's something I'll come to later. So let's take a look at some of the real facts of the Viking Age, rather than the usual lurid and often inaccurate images of them. But of course, blood and guts and rampaging bearded men in horned helmets, well, that's so much more exciting than everyday domestic matters or cultural or social aspects, I suppose. Bashing somebody's head in with an axe is a more enthralling image for your TV audience than, planting crops, fishing, having consensual sex with women you're actually married to, or indeed changing your clothes frequently. It certainly makes for more gripping footage in the movies and TV shows, a little bit of come with an axe and his brain has just gone in 3 different directions. Yeah, I suppose that's more eye-catching than ploughing a field. The so-called Viking Age is dated quite precisely, as commencing with the raid on the monastery located on the island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria on the 8th of June 793 AD, though given the recent finding of considerably older Viking ships in the Baltic, that could perhaps be set back to circa 700 AD, and the age ending with the death of the great Norwegian king Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, or Harold the Hard Ruler, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September 1066. And curiously enough, both events taking place in England, very far from the Scandinavian homeland of the Norse peoples. Of course, the Norse people didn't all magically appear from nowhere in June of 793, dragon-headed ships popping up all over the place. Ship, No, and then suddenly vanish in a puff of smoke in September of 1066. Poof, they're all gone, no more Vikings. No, they existed long before and after those very precise dates. But it makes for a convenient category to place the Vikings in for the purpose of historical reference, and it is related to the most well-known aspect of them as far as the general public are concerned: raiding. Yes, they will always be associated with that, I suppose. Well, there's a very good reason, I suppose, for that. You see, Vikings did not officially exist before 793, or 700, take your choice, nor after 1066. But wait, didn't I just mention the fact that the Norse people were around both before and after those dates? Yes, indeed I did, because they were. Oh yes, they were. But Vikings, they weren't. Oh no, you're confused? Well, see, the answer is quite simple. All Vikings were Norse, but not all Norse were Vikings. In fact, only some Norsemen, and some women as well, were Vikings. And usually only during the summer months. But they never called themselves Vikings because they weren't. And even when they were, when they were Vikings in the sense we think of them today, they still weren't Vikings as such. Now, yes, you're really confused now, aren't you? Yes. Well, let's just have an overall look at the people of Scandinavia in those times. The Norse people initially inhabited the lands of present-day Denmark, Norway and Sweden. We can really include Frisia, I suppose, as well, though those countries didn't exist in their modern form for much of the Viking Age, being comprised of numerous little kingdoms, earldoms and so on. And they would later spread their influence to the British Isles, to Ireland, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, the Orkneys and Shetland Islands, Greenland, France, the Isle of Man, what is now known as Russia, and even as far as Constantinople and Baghdad, as well as North America. 500 years before Columbus didn't discover it. No, Columbus, you see, never actually saw the North American mainland. No, he saw some islands in the Caribbean, and to say he discovered America, well, that would be a bit like claiming someone discovered Spain by finding the Canary Islands. The Norse were the finest navigators of their time, or perhaps even since. Their ships were a marvel of technology, as were some of their construction techniques. They had some of the most advanced social ideas of the early Middle Ages, and they were the finest warriors of their time, even being hired by Byzantine Emperor Basil II to form his personal bodyguard, becoming the formidable Varangian Guard. And for most of the Viking Age, they were pagans, something closely connected with much of their culture and attitudes, until Christianity eventually replaced the gods of Osgaldr, and the old religion almost completely disappeared by the end of the 11th century. Yes, all right, that's all wonderful. So, yes, that's all wonderful, but how? How, you ask, are the Vikings not Vikings, and even the ones who were Vikings for only part of the year, but they didn't call themselves Vikings, even when they were Vikings, and they weren't? Yes. You see, basically the term Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, was not a term of nationality. It did not apply to a national group of people. A Norseman or woman would have called themselves a Dane, a Norwegian, a Swede, or a Frisian. Those were their nationalities. Viking was a term that referred to those persons who went out in a ship to raid, to trade, to settle abroad. In other words, to go Viking. So a Scandinavian couldn't be a Viking, but they could go Viking, til fara I Vikingar, as it was in Old Norse. Rather like a hiker can be someone of any nationality who goes out for a hike. You wouldn't call a German hiking through the Schwarzwald a hiker. He or she would be a German who happened to be engaging in that activity. And if you asked them what they were, they'd say, I'm German. They're not going to say, I'm a hiker. No. If you could go back to, say, the 9th century, and you asked a man ploughing his field in Norway if he was Vikinger, well, he'd probably say, of course not. Do you see a boat? How could I be going Vikinger when I'm here ploughing my field, you idiot? Yes. And since they tended to raid during the good weather in summer and return to Scandinavia or other bases elsewhere during the winter, well, they were, strictly speaking, only Vikings for part of the year. So to be a Viking, you had to get into one of those, you had to get into a ship and go somewhere in the ship and do something when you got to wherever you got to in that ship. If you didn't do any of those things, well, to use that famous Jewish joke, to you, you may be a Viking, but to a Viking, you ain't no Viking. That summed it up perfectly. But the term Viking is so often seen as indicating a nationality, like they were all from the same place, ruled by the same ruler, and they all fought together against common enemies, which is totally wrong. They actually fought each other, often quite as much as they did anyone else. There are various ideas on where the term Vikinger actually came from and its original true meaning, but it came to mean one who went raiding or trading, a pirate, a seafarer, an explorer, a settler, all rolled into one. It was an all-encompassing nautical term. But another interesting thing about it is that nobody at that time used it to describe them, other than the Norse themselves, in that very limited seafaring-related context. No one else called them Vikings. And had you asked anyone in England or Ireland, or anywhere else for that matter, during the 8th or 9th centuries about the Vikings, they wouldn't have had the faintest idea what you were talking about. If you had said, "The Vikings are coming," people would have said, "So? Who are they?" Yeah. The German tribes knew them as the Ascomani, the Ashmen from Ashwood, used in their ships. To the Anglo-Saxons, they were the Dene, or Danes, as well as heathens. To the Celtic Irish, they were Dovgal, the dark foreigners, or Danes, or the Fingal, the fair foreigners, Norwegians, as well as Gentiles. To the Franks, they were the Northmen, and they later became the Normans. The Arabs, the Slavs, and the Byzantines called them the Rus, from a word meaning to row a boat, from which came the names of Russia and Belarus, where they settled. The term Viking was only introduced into English centuries after any true Vikings had ceased to exist, and it later came to mean not just seaborne raiders, traders, and explorers from Scandinavia, but anyone from anywhere the Norse had settled, like Ireland or the Faroe Islands, or anything connected with them. Viking this and Viking that. Things such as Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ships, and whatever else you can think of got the Viking prefix added to them, even though none of them actually had anything whatsoever to do with the word, except for a ship, and even then only in terms of those who sailed in it, not the ship itself. There was no such thing as a Viking ship. Their ships were, well, they were just ships. Ships in which people were going Viking, but not the ship itself. There was no Viking music or Viking art, though there was plenty of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish music and art. The term Viking is so misused, out of context, completely. So as a national identity, the Vikings weren't Vikings. Nor, of course, did they go around in horn helmets, which would have been rather awkward when going through low doorways, and a positive health hazard to anyone beside them in a shield wall. You move suddenly sideways to dodge a spear thrust, and you impale Eric standing beside you. He now has your helmet stuck in his ear. And big horns sticking out from the helmet, well, they could have been grabbed and used by an adversary as a handle to pull the person off balance or pull the helmet off their head altogether. That myth may have started as a way of demonizing them, the horns, to equate them with the devil. Because you remember, they were pagans, so of course, obviously, they were well in with Satan. I mean, they had lovely chats with him every day. Of course they did, Though it really only took hold of popular imagination in the 19th century, largely through the Germanic mythological operas of Richard Wagner, Der Ring des Nibelungen, or The Ring of the Nibelungs. And the costume designers for those operas started putting horns on helmets. Numerous artists of the time also began to draw Wagner's characters with these huge horns that looked as though they'd got them from a Texas Longhorn, or wings that would have done credit to an eagle. And from then on, not just the Vikings, but any Germanic character, like Roland or anyone you care to mention, began to be drawn in the same manner. They had horns put onto their helmets. How strange that they have gained such fame in the popular mind under the wrong name and wearing something they never actually did. And not only did they never wear horned helmets, very few Vikings wore a helmet at all. Of all the graves across Scandinavia where men, and some women too, have been found buried with combat weapons, shields, and so forth, indicating their status as warriors, the number of helmets, or even bits of helmets, that have been found can be counted on one hand with a couple of fingers to spare. That in itself shows that helmets were very far from the norm, and the idea of every Viking in a helmet is very far from the truth. Helmets would have been expensive, as would fancy swords, and most of these men, farmers, fishermen, and the like, they wouldn't have been able to afford them. Now, they're often seen as scruffy, disheveled and completely uncivilized killers and rapists, but that's just as wrong as the horned helmets. They weren't unkempt, filthy barbarians, but actually probably the cleanest people in Europe during the Middle Ages, bathing once a week and washing their hands and faces every day. Something that astonished the Anglo-Saxons, who might only, bathe once a year, or twice, maybe if they were real clean freaks, if at all in some cases. And what really bothered the Saxons, the Norse changed their clothing regularly. Now, that was just weird. They changed them. Why would you do that? You're taking all the trouble to put your clothes on. Why bother to keep taking them off? You could do that when you had the annual bath, couldn't you? All that work, on, off. It didn't make any sense to the Saxons. It was just weird. Yes. That says a lot about the Anglo-Saxons. If a deodorant salesperson could go back in a time machine to those days, they'd make a fortune. And both men and women took great trouble with their hair and grooming in general. Beautifully made combs carved from horn being one of the most common items found in graves or excavations of Norse sites, and earwax removing tools, things like that. Nor did they do nothing but raid, pillage, and rape. Admittedly, they did a lot of raiding, pillaging, and raping, and they did it very well, if that's the right word. Well, yes, they were bloody good at it, with some emphasis on the bloody part, of course. But while they did do those things, and everybody else in Europe at the time was doing pretty much the same things, they were also the finest traders, explorers, navigators, and settlers of their own day, and they were quite happy to trade rather than raid if the opportunity arose, since that way they got what they wanted without loss to themselves, and often a greater profit. There was little point in gaining great wealth on a raid if you got yourself killed doing it. Wasn't much use to you when you were, brown bread. And once they established permanent settlement somewhere, they were not loath to assimilate through marriage with the peoples they found themselves among, or convert to the religion of those people, as happened very strikingly here in Ireland, where eventually there was no difference between Norse and Gael. A good example being King Sideric Silkbeard, who became ruler of Dublin in the late 10th century, and his father was a Norse nobleman and his mother an Irish princess, which was very, very common by that time. Similar integration occurred in what is now Russia, as well as France, where the land of the Northmen became very quickly Normandy and thoroughly French. The Norse didn't seem to have any great problem about integration or conversion with other peoples, unlike later Europeans in the colonial era of the 18th and 19th centuries, where integration with the subjected races, and certainly conversion to their pagan beliefs of the various empires, it was unthinkable. No, damn it all, old chap. They're just natives, after all. Yes, natives. Good heavens. You couldn't marry one of them, could you, old chap? You might as well marry a horse, what? No, absolutely unthinkable. Another point in the Vikings' favour. In Part 2, we shall explore more misrepresentations, half-truths, and inaccuracies about the so-called Viking Age. And there are so many of them, even the term used to describe them being wrong. As I've said, it was not a term of national identity or culture. They could go Viking, but they couldn't be Viking. And that, I think, sums it up perfectly. So, until next time, I shall say farewell. See you in the next one. Bye for now.